I read your dossier, Mr. Intellectual. What would you say your record says about you?
That I think for myself.
You think for yourself. When I was 8 years old, defending Stalingrad, I didn't think for myself. When the motherland asked for our lives, we gave. My father didn't think of himself, he gave. My mother didn't think of herself, she gave. My brother didn't think of himself, he gave. My comrades tied a rope around my waist and lowered me on top of Nazi tanks. I stuffed Molotovs under turret and cannon, and then they pulled me up again. 8 years old. They called me Tank Boy. I took a lot of Nazi tanks. A lot.
I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are tonight's entertainment.
All right, we got white pussy, black pussy, Spanish pussy.
Certainly illustrates the first word.
Get away from her, you bitch!
I'm your huckleberry. $10,000 for me by myself. For that you get the head, the tail, the whole damn thing.
Target? Yes, sir! And you will know my name is the law when I lay my vengeance upon thee.
Hey folks, and welcome to episode 576 of Talk Without Rhythm. I am your host, El Gorro. This week on the podcast, I'm unleashing the podcast of war with 1980's The Dogs of War and 1988's The Beast of War. Should be a fun episode, folks. All that and more right after this.
The following message is a paid advertisement for the Cult of Muscle podcast. The Cult of Muscle. You're either in it or you're dead.
It's the dawning of a new age. The halls of Valhalla have been shuttered. The heroes of yore have either retreated to the shadows or taken to capering for the amusement of the small folk. Their past glories a distant memory. The barbells have been torn from their once puma-strong grips. The beards shorn from their square jaws, only to be transplanted onto flannel-clad, puny weaklings with fingers barely powerful enough to strum a ukulele. The time has come, my brothers, to restore order from the chaos. No longer will our heroes be forgotten. No longer will their great deeds be viewed through a foggy lens of irony. Hear now our rallying cry as we scream it from the mountaintops, as we bellow it from iTunes and Libsyn and Facebook. It's time to join the cult, my brothers. So don your cloaks and enter the Cult of Muscle.
Alright folks, so as I said, this is a podcast of war. Not a Patreon pick, since at this point, at the time that I was doing this episode, we had fulfilled all of the Patreon pick obligations, and at this point I want to take a time to say a big thank you to all the patrons who have supported the show and who have booked episodes as part of the Patreon picks program. Once again, a reminder, if you have not submitted a Patreon pick and you are qualified to do so, please get it to me. I've had one come in while I was putting this episode together, so we'll be back to the Patreon picks next week, and potentially for the next couple weeks after that if there are some dangling obligations left over, or, you know, if some people sign up. That's what we did for that's what happened with the next week. So, yeah, very much appreciate that. Very much appreciate everybody who continues to support the show, or supported for just long enough to get the Patreon pick. Either way, it's all very, very appreciated. But this episode is not a Patreon pick, though it does come from one of our listeners. Now, for a fair bit now, there was a gentleman who was emailing me by the name of Nick, and was throwing out recommendations for the show. Now, this happens from time to time. You know, you do the show long enough, and people say, hey, you should check out this thing. Now, we have a mechanism for booking these kinds of episodes. It's obviously through the Patreon picks, but Nick was very persistent. For over a year plus, he kept sending in a recommendation to check out a film. And you know what? Sometimes persistence pays off. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I completely ignore it. But it just so happened that the film that Nick recommended was one that I'd never heard of, and was a film that actually seemed kind of interesting to me, and also would provide a thematic counterpoint or a good thematic pairing to a film I've been wanting to talk about on the show for some time. The movie I'm speaking, of course, is the 1988 film The Beast of War, which was completely new to me by the time when Nick originally recommended it to me. But looking into it and reading about it, thought, this seems kind of interesting. An American-made film about the Soviets fighting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And what's more, a film that is broadly sympathetic to both sides of that conflict. Both are a sensible enemy at that time, since this film was released in 1988, where we were right at the tail end of the Cold War, though some people would probably claim that the Cold War never really ended, and we've never really ceased our hostilities with our friends over in Russia. But what's more, the fact that since this film was coming out in the 1980s, at a time where the Soviets were making major fucking inroads and experiencing their own version of Vietnam within Afghanistan, we had a vested interest in our popular culture of portraying the native Afghanis, and most particularly the freedom fighters known as the Mujahideen, in a very, very sympathetic light. Now, of course, pop cultural depictions of Afghanistan have shifted over the years as our position within Afghanistan has shifted over the years, and we'll of course talk about that when we get into the episode, but it was interesting enough that I decided to put it as one of those kind of maybes somewhere down the line. If I had a gap in the schedule, maybe I'd check out The Beast of War. Particularly, again, since it did provide a nice thematic tie-in with the other film that I'll be discussing on this, that of course being 1980's The Dogs of War. Now, I've made no bones about it on previous episodes of the podcast. One of my particular favorite subgenres in the broader action umbrella is kind of mercenary movies, men on a mission type films. And a lot of these mercenary movies were set in Africa, where mercenaries ran roughshod over a lot of people throughout this area. Now again, when one engages with these kinds of films, and we'll certainly get into the particulars of that when we get into The Dogs of War, you have to somewhat suspend your socio-political views a little bit to necessarily appreciate some of the things that are going on to there, because, yeah, a lot of the maneuvers that were happening with vis-a-vis mercenaries in Africa, when you start looking at, who was funding them, what they were doing, yeah, it gets really fucking sketchy really fucking quick. However, it did provide a fertile ground for some very interesting action films, and Dogs of War certainly qualifies of that, particularly with its rather unconventional lead. Now, I've talked about, again, several of these sort of mercenaries in Africa type films, and while Dogs of War is not ranking amongst my favorite, that particular distinction would go to films like Dark of the Sun, which I've discussed on a previous episode, or Wild Geese, which I've also discussed on a previous episode. Dogs of War still has some interesting stuff at play. And, again, with the two titles, The Dogs of War and The Beast of War, it made for a nice, interesting kind of double feature. Also made somewhat more poignant when one considers the shifting socio-political landscape within these two regions, certainly shifting away from the 1980s, and then also in the process of shifting away even now, as different sort of pseudo-imperialistic entities are laying claims onto these areas, or abandoning claims in these areas. It felt weirdly timely to discuss these two 1980s films. I'll only briefly talk about some of the current politics that are going on there, because they're ever evolving, and as I've said many times in the past, I am terribly unqualified to speak to the greater particularities of these particular regions and the stuff that's going on in these areas and the broader history that at play within these areas. I'm a movie guy, and while there is some value to be found in finding the real life stuff that informs these films, for a deeper dive into the real-life ramifications of freedom fighters in Afghanistan, or mercenaries in Africa, or the maneuvers that are being played by larger interests, whether they be countries or whether they be corporations, you're best off going off into a different podcast that's more informed along those lines. I can't even recommend any good ones, but I'm sure they exist out there. Right? Right, yeah. A lot of smart people, a lot of people doing podcasts. I just watch fucking movies. So let's do that.
It's a groovy time. And now for something completely different.
Okay, so first up we have The Dogs of War from 1980. Before we get into that, let's listen to the trailer.
Academy Award winner Christopher Walken. The Dogs of War.
The job pays $10,000.
15.
It's only a reconnaissance.
The Reconnaissance.
The reconnaissance is no good if you don't come back.
I always come back.
Welcome to Zangaro.
Whoa, wait a minute!
This is not America, Mr. Brown.
The mission.
Could a well-trained, well-equipped mercenary force succeed?
Anybody want to know how we're going to do this?
Give me names, dates. I'll see to it the money gets paid. And run hard deals. These guys put up $1 million, so let's make sure there's change, because I figure we ought to keep it.
$1,500 1,000 rounds.
If you're trying to stick us, I can do business down the street.
It's the ultimate in killing technology. No, you put the right mix in this thing, and its killing potential is fantastic. Fragmentation, grenades, tactical, anti-tank, anti-personnel.
The weapons.
Whose war are you going to fight?
Cry havoc and let slip the Dogs of War. Academy Award winner Christopher Walken. Tom Berenger. The bestseller by Frederick Forsyth. The Dogs of War.
So 1980's The Dogs of War. It was directed by John Irvin, written by Gary DeVore, George Malco, and an uncredited writing credit for Michael Cimino. It was based off of the novel, the 1974 novel, The Dogs of War by Frederick Forsyth. Of course, both of these titles drawing from that line from Julius Caesar, the play from William Shakespeare. Cry havoc and let slip the Dogs of War. Such a badass line. Anyway, and the film stars Christopher Walken, Tom Berenger, Colin Blakely, Hugh Millay, Paul Freeman, Jean-Francois Stevenin, JoBeth Williams shows up briefly in this film. Ed O'Neill shows up briefly in this film. Jim Broadbent is also briefly in this film, though he's not doesn't play a huge role. There's also a curious amount of people that were from Indiana Jones, or later showed up in Raiders of the Lost Ark, that showed up throughout this movie. Most notably, what was it? Paul Freeman? Yeah, it was Paul Freeman, I believe, who was Belloc in Raiders of the Lost Ark. He was in this film. And who was the other one? The other one was George Harris, who plays the character of Colonel Bobby. He was Captain Katanga in Raiders of the Lost Ark, and then later on he would show up in Black Hawk Down as the character Osman Aliato. So yeah, nice little bit of connections across the board. Fun little things in there. All right, so the premise of The Dogs of War. It follows a mercenary by the name of James Shannon, played by Christopher Walken, who, after just finishing up a job in Central America, he gets approached by a British industrialist, particularly a gentleman representing a mineral concern, with a job in a fictional African nation of Zangaro. Basically, This British businessman wants to get access to the resources in Zangaro, but they have a problem. The current leadership in Zangaro, basically a military dictatorship underneath a General Kimba, is very unstable. And they don't want to invest in an area that may very well, succumb to a coup, because then you lose all of your investments. So what they want Shannon to do is to travel to the nation of Zangaro and get kind of the lay of the land. Figure out if Kimba is about to be deposed, or if his regime is stable enough that the Brits can consider investing within him. So Shannon travels to Zangaro under the cover of being a bird watcher or a naturalist, taking photos for a nature magazine, and begins doing recon. However, he's very quickly discovered by the Zangaran authorities that he is not exactly what he seems. He's promptly arrested, brutally tortured, though he doesn't give up any information, and kicked out of the country. Returning back to Europe, he informs the British businessman that he wants absolutely nothing to do with Zangaro, that General Kimba is a fucking psychopath, but he is, his regime is pretty stable. However, the industrialist offers Shannon a new job, that they don't want to be in business with General Kimba, and if the people in Zangaro can't get rid of him themselves, they want to hire Shannon and his mercenary team to do it for them, to basically launch a coup d'etat against General Kimba. Now, Shannon is initially hesitant about getting into this because, he had some bad experiences in Zangaro, and the gentleman that they're bringing to replace General Kimba, a Colonel Bobby, again played by George Harris, is not the best guy. It doesn't seem to be the best sort of situation. However, eventually Shannon agrees to take it. It's going to pay very well, and he kind of wants to get some revenge on Kimba and his forces. So he assembles his military team, including Tom Berenger's character of Drew Bakley. Colin Blakely also is in this. Actually, I think Colin Blakely is the reporter that's also popping up into this. Yeah, it was North, I think. A bunch of other mercenaries get together. A great deal of this movie is all about setting up logistics of a coup. And then they return to Zangaro, and then they let slip the Dogs of War. And this is where the film becomes a full-on action movie. The action in this film is actually really relegated into the last 30 minutes of the film. The rest of the film is largely about recon and logistics of setting up a coup. So if you're going in expecting a full-on Christopher Walken action movie, you won't necessarily get that with the Dogs of War. However, you will get a very interesting story, and sometimes that's enough. Alright, so as I said, this was based off of a 1974 novel by Frederick Forsyth. Now, if you're not too terribly familiar with his name, you may be familiar with some of the other stuff that he wrote, because his big first novel, as I recall, that was released in 1971, and would later on get adapted into at least, I think, 3 different adaptations, was Day of the Jackal, which should, again, immediately ring some bells for some people out there, because, of course, you had the 1973 version of Day of the Jackal, and then you had the 1997 adaptation simply called The Jackal. Now, Frederick Forsyth himself was an interesting guy. He started off as a war correspondent. He had served in the Royal Air Force as part of his national service, flying the de Havilland Vampire, which is a badass fucking sounding plane, and a cool-looking jet, too, an interesting little design, but you can see why it didn't necessarily take off. Still, the de Havilland Vampire was a cool plane. Joined Reuters and then later the BBC, and started doing foreign correspondent work. And one of the key bits in his journalism career came in the 1960s, where he was stationed in Nigeria, right in the middle of the Nigerian civil war between the Nigerian forces that were backed by the UK and the secessionist the Republic of Biafra. Again, we can't go into the too terribly strong particulars of this conflict, and needless to say, it was bloody, and it was something of a quagmire for the United Kingdom, particularly since at this point, the news at this time was very much dominated by America's fighting in Vietnam. And at the same time, England was finding itself embroiled in a situation that could very well become their Vietnam. And so there was a decided interest amongst the BBC not to really report on what was going on during this Nigerian civil war, particularly due to the fact that the Biafrans were putting up a much greater deal of a fight and a resistance that they were really expecting. And the Nigerians, who were backed by England, were not doing great. So, anyway, Forsyth, however, was on the ground. He was seeing the conflict. He was seeing the mercenaries that were operating in this theater, and he wanted to report on it, but he was being told no. So at this point, Forsyth pretty much went solo. He quit the BBC, he started doing his own reporting freelance, and eventually started shifting his experiences into fiction, writing stuff like, again, Day of the Jackal, and then other novels like The Odessa File, The Dogs of War, of course, Fourth Protocol, and The Fist of God, to name some of his more notable works that came out of this time period. Also, according to him, he was, during this time, an unpaid informant for MI6. So that's fun. So the biggest thing with Forsyth's novels is that because he had sort of first-hand experience with this world, with these theaters of conflict, and in particular with the mercenaries that were operating in these areas, he was able to bring a great deal of assumed verisimilitude to his novels. Now, I can't speak necessarily to the authenticity of these things because I've never been a mercenary, but from everything I've read from people that are slightly more in the know, there seems to be a lot of truth to the fictionalized accounts that Forsyth was writing about. And indeed, The Dogs of War was drawn very heavily from his experience during the Nigerian Civil War, or the Biafran War. And so what we find in this novel, and by extension of that, the film that comes out of it, is, from all accounts, a very accurate view of the kind of men that were operating in this field. In the case of the mercenaries, such as Christopher Walken's character, the kind of men that were employing the men in this field, and such as the case of the British industrialist who was trying to get access to the platinum in Zangaro, and also the particularities of setting up a coup, operating into this sort of shadow world, and the sheer amount of logistics and reconnaissance and planning that goes into one of these kinds of operations. And one thing it really does help establish is the lines that can be drawn between this type of film, which can be broadly defined as a men on a mission film. You know, it's the kind of stuff that you find in, like, The Dirty Dozen, and also, to a certain extent, films like Dark of the Sun or Wild Geese. You know, get a group of people together, give them an objective, send them out there. Lines of comparison can be drawn between these type of films and, of course, the more celebrated heist movie. And indeed, it's very easy to see the points of similarity between them. They all involve a goal. In this case, it's, the toppling of a country. They involve us having to assemble a group of specialists in order to pull off that goal, plan the particulars of that operation, and then put it into action. The thing that separates the man on the mission film from the heist film, and what gives it kind of the cooler Camaro driving younger brother vibe in comparison to the heist film, is the man on the mission films tend to involve more guns and explosions. But this film is very much so structured like a traditional heist film, in that the greatest percentage of the film is dedicated towards the planning of the operation, or the heist, except the only thing that they're stealing in this film is a country. Now, what I find fascinating about this film was the choice of the protagonist in the form of Christopher Walken, because while this film is not an out-and-out action film, at least until it gets to the final third of the movie, or indeed just the last 30 minutes of the film, when the action does come, it is full on, with lots of big explosions, lots of gunplay, and lots of comically oversized guns, such as the XM18 gun that Christopher Walken uses in this, and that you will see on pretty much every poster for this film. It itself a variation of the Manville gun, which is just this big fucking revolver, two-handed revolving rifle of destruction. That looks pretty badass, but from all indications that I've heard, not a terribly practical gun. Very, very cool, but you can see why it wasn't necessarily, didn't see greater use outside of particular films. A variation of the Manville gun would show up in Terminator 2 as the grenade launcher that the T-800 uses. Anyway, there is a great deal of action that arises out of that. So to cast Christopher Walken into that particular role seems like a deviation for him. Indeed, when one thinks Christopher Walken, one does not immediately think man of action. But I think it's his non-action qualities, his strength as a performer, in particular his very piercing eyes, and his ability to convey trauma and also a cold calculation that makes him an ideal sort of mercenary for this particular world. You know, we're sold by Hollywood the idea of the mercenary as these kind of, you know, muscle-bound action avatars, you know, gods of war striding across the battlefield. Whereas if you actually look into the real sort of men who made this their trade and start looking at them, a lot of them look just kind of normal. They were regular people that just happened to find out that they could make a decent amount of living doing war for a living. And so I think Christopher Walken brings an interesting sort of quality to the role as this kind of mercenary, particularly in the later film, where you actually get to see the toll that what he has to do plays upon him. The scars that he has, physical and mental, from this life at war. And it's all very understated. But by casting a Christopher Walken, you really get to have that presence, that sort of unchained quality. And I have to think that it was perhaps his appearance in Deer Hunter that really kind of got the producers of this film, whether that be Larry DeWay, Norman Jewison, or Patrick J. Palmer, or indeed director John Irvin, to cast him in this role, because he seems to be channeling a similar kind of vibe. Granted, this film isn't as psychologically devastating as something like The Deer Hunter, but you can see him operating in a very similar mode. And he's supported by, as I said, a very interesting supporting cast. I mean, again, you got Tom Berenger in here. Not playing a hugely substantial role, but still a very interesting one as, you know, kind of Shannon's second in command. And he definitely gets to play up a slightly more man of action. He looks a little bit more the type, particularly when they're going by slow boat to Zangaro and just blowing the shit out of oil drums in the middle of the ocean to test their various armaments. There's some fun stuff to be found in this film. Though again, the biggest thing that I could tell people about this movie is that if you're going in expecting it to be a full-on action movie, you may find yourself kind of bored, because again, the majority of this film is turned over into more of the planning of things. When the action comes, the action is fucking great, but the majority of this film is about sort of setting up this operation, which can cause it to move a little bit slow, but for me, it is in the particularities of this operation. It is in the planning. It is in the putting the pieces together, assembling the crew, assembling the equipment, that a lot of the very interesting stuff arises. And also where a lot of the inherent cynicism of this film rolls around. Because one thing I do enjoy about this film, and where it fits into why I can enjoy watching it, even though when some of the material that it's dealing with, i.e. people from outside of a country launching a coup d'etat for corporate gain, one of the things that this film does well is that it involves itself in that conversation. It takes a hard look at the people that would hire a group of mercenaries in order to depose a dictator simply so they can put their own puppet dictator in place in order to get access to the resources of that country. Never mind the fact that very little of that money is probably going to go to the actual people of that country. It takes a look at that and it reveals the corruption within it. And for as cynical as this film can be from time to time, for as hard-edged as this film could be from time to time, it also manages to be somewhat hopeful. It allows itself to kind of have a glimmer of a better conclusion by the time we've reached the end, though it's a conclusion that is purchased with a lot of blood and a lot of trauma on the behalf of the various characters at play within this movie. So yeah, I really enjoy it, and I also enjoy where it kind of exists within the broader filmography of director John Irvin, of whom this was his debut feature film. He'd worked on various other projects before this, but I believe this was his first film as a director. Let me just verify that right quick. Let's see. What was his first one? Looks like he worked on a couple documentaries, lots of TV movies. So he's working on TV before that. Actually, one notable thing he directed the year before his Dogs of War, which would serve as his theatrical debut, is he did a lot of work for the BBC. And a lot of work for other British television, ITV as well. But he also directed the 7-episode Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy adaptation, the one with Alec Guinness, which curiously enough, I'm actually in the middle of watching. I ended up importing that release as a tie-in to a book that I recently read, which I don't think I talked about on the show recently, this excellent book that I read. We're going to go off on a tangent here. But recently I picked up this great book called England Screaming by Sean Hogan, which I picked it up with the idea that it was going to be just a book about British horror films. And it is, and it isn't, because what it actually is a fictional book that tells a kind of alternate history of England, built up around various British horror films. So it's presuming that all of these excellent British horror films, like The Devil Rides Out, or The Omen, or so what are some of the other ones that show up in this? Deathline is in this. Hellraiser is in this. Blood on Satan's Claw. A lot of really quality British horror films. What if they all existed within one world? What if characters from these different films interacted with each other? And what if all of these films were part of basically the broader supernatural unraveling of England? It's a fascinating book, and for a cinephile, it was an absolute treat. And I actually highly, highly recommend England Screaming. But after I finished the book, I started tracking down the various films and television shows that informed the book, where Hogan drew characters from. And one of the ones that he particularly drew from was Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. So it's not just horror stuff. He was also going into some interesting espionage stuff. And while I'd seen the film adaptation with Gary Oldman, I'd never seen the original series, so I ended up importing that, because apparently the American Blu-ray release of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy is the version that was broadcast on PBS, wherein they took the 7 episodes, cut out some material, and cut it down to 6 episodes. So if you want the full uncut version of the original 1979 miniseries, again directed by John Irvin, who would of course go on to direct Dogs of War, you have to import it, or if you're in the UK, you can just watch it that way. Anyway, that was the tangent. So Irvin did a fair bit of television work before moving to the big screen with Dogs of War, but then after that, he ended up doing a big variety of films. Immediately following Dogs of War, he discussed Ghost Story, or he directed Ghost Story, that adaptation of the Peter Straub novel, which I've discussed on a previous episode of the show, and he would end up returning into more kind of action films moving on, directing Schwarzenegger in Raw Deal in 1986, he directed Hamburger Hill, he directed the 1991 version of Robin Hood, which will have a slight tie-in to the next director that we're going to be talking about. He had had this interesting little career, and it's interesting that it sort of kicked off, at least theatrically, with Dogs of War. And it would sort of define some of the stuff that he would be working with. Less so in action films like Raw Deal, but when you look at something like Hamburger Hill, it was a nice balance between kinetic action and also some interesting characterization. You know, Hamburger Hill may not be included amongst, the upper echelon of great Vietnam movies, but it certainly should be part of that broader conversation, because I think that it is a fantastic film, one that I need to revisit at some point down the line, because it's been a fair number of years since I've last seen that film. So, he had some, Irvin would go on for some higher profile stuff, as I mentioned, and somewhat overlooked into that as a result would be perhaps some of his earlier work, like The Dogs of War. Indeed, this is not a film that I hear get brought up. in a lot of sort of mainstream conversation. This is a film that does sort of exist within that cultier realm. I mean, I first heard about this film just from various film groups that I was in. You know, people talking about badass mercenary films. Indeed, my buddy Zom from Silver and Gold, I think he was the first person to ever turn me on to Dogs of War. And I'm glad he did, because this film exists within a very... a nice sweet spot for me. Not only is it the Men on the Mission film, but it's a film that deals with the actual logistics of that. And it's anchored by a very strong, understated, but very captivating performance from Christopher Walken. And again, while action is not the main goal of this film, when the action does come, it is truly fantastic. Enough for me to highly recommend seeking it out if you get the opportunity to do so. Now, here's where you run into some issues. Possibly. Possibility. I can't fucking talk today. As a slight aside, before we move on to things, this is the last day of 4th of July weekend. I've been drinking heavily for the past couple of days. Don't have a huge hangover right now, but just enough to kind of make my my brain a little mushy at the seams. So you'll have to beg your indulgence as I try to muddle through my conversations in these films. Now, if you want to watch Dogs of War, good news it is currently streaming on Amazon Prime, but be warned, if you do look up Dogs of War, for some reason there are two entries that'll show up. One is available to rent, the other one that you can just stream. I have no idea what the difference is between the two of them. Normally they tend to mash those entries into one, but it could just be something fucked on their website. But I do assure you, at the time of this recording, it is available to stream as part of a Prime subscription. So if you're subscribed to Amazon Prime, at least in America, you can watch The Dogs of War. Now, if you want to go for a physical copy of this film, it gets a little bit harder. The DVD is still readily available, and you can pick it up pretty cheap, but if you want to go the Blu-ray option, the only North American release of The Dogs of War that I've been able to find was a limited release that was done by the label Twilight Time. And if you're at all familiar with Twilight Time, you will know that they do excellent Blu-ray releases, but they tend to be very, very limited production runs, and they don't tend to reprint a lot of their stuff. So basically, if you don't jump right on a new Twilight Time release, chances are you miss it. As such, a new copy of a Twilight Time release of The Dogs of War, the secondary market has just gone nuts with this thing, and I see it's running for like $160. Now, there is a British release, or a Region 2 release, that was put out by Eureka Classics, which will only run you about $15, because I think that thing is still actively in print. However, it is a Region 2 Blu-ray, or Region B Blu-ray. So, unless you have a multi-region Blu-ray player, which at this point everybody should get one, it's a great investment if you are a movie fan. You might have some difficulties playing it. On a related note, I actually found a interesting sort of workaround for those particular kind of woes, just in case you don't want to invest in a modified Blu-ray player that will allow you to play multiple regions, because they can be a little tricky. You never know exactly what you're getting. All of those Blu-ray players that can play multiple regions, they're all aftermarket modifications, so you are relying upon the people who did those mods, who cracked the firmware in order to allow it to play multiple regions. It can sometimes be a coin flip, whether or not it works, or whether it doesn't, or for how long it works. I've been lucky so far. My Blu-ray player has held up for many years now, but unfortunately, it's no longer available, so I can't point you towards that. However, there is a more budget-conscious way that people in different regions can play Blu-rays without necessarily having to invest in a full Blu-ray player. What you do is, if you have a computer, purchase a external Blu-ray player. You know, one of the ones that connects using USB 2 or USB 3. USB 3 usually. So you want just do a search for an external Blu-ray drive. I'm just going to do that right now. External Blu-ray drive for the PC. You can usually pick one up for about $100. I know I got one from Myths Tech that I have plugged into my computer right now. It plays just fine. A little bit on the loud side, but otherwise works pretty decent, not too terribly expensive. Now, when you plug that in, The region settings for any sort of those devices, those external Blu-rays, are defined by the Blu-ray's firmware, the little logic that informs the hardware of your computer. And it allows you to shift the region codes a set number of times. Basically, if you can set it to any region you want. However, after you do it a set number of times, it will lock in that region. So it's not very ideal if you're going to be swapping discs all the time. Now, you could just set it to the region that's separate from your other player, and then boom, whenever you need to watch a disc, you can just like a region B disc, you can pop it in your drive that's been set to region B. Boom, you're done. However, there is a piece of software, a freeware software called what is this thing? It's called Leawo. I think it's called Leawo. I'm gonna just get the proper writing of this. Leawo, Leawo, which is a freeware Blu-ray software. Now, you're going to need Leawo anyway, because without Leawo, you won't be able to play the discs on your external drive. But one of the cool things with Leawo, which, as I said, is free, it's freeware, though there is a paid version available, is through the software, you can actually change the regions on your disc. And by using that software to change the region, it won't count against your firmware shifts on your external drive. Again, you have only a certain number of region changes you can do on a disc on the player's firmware, but by doing it through Leawo, you can change it any number of times. So essentially, for an investment of $100, for an external Blu-ray player for your computer, plus the Leawo software, you can then have access to pretty much any disc released in any region, as long as it's playing through your computer. So that's your hint. That's your hint for the day. Get an external Blu-ray player, get the Leawo software, look up online how to shift the regions through Leawo, and then boom. You now have a rather cheap alternative to a multi-region Blu-ray player, and then can import to your heart's content and get access to a bunch of really excellent releases from all over the world, including the Dogs of War, if you feel so inclined to check out that release from Eureka. I'm certainly going to purchase it, because this is a film that I very much enjoy, and I wouldn't mind owning a physical copy of it. Of course, if you want to skip all of that, it is currently streaming on Amazon Prime. It is available to rent on most digital platforms. It is out there. I just thought you guys might appreciate a little bit of kind of cheap alternatives, because I know people have asked me in the past about kind of multi-region Blu-ray players. This is going to be a cheap way to do it. All you have to do is buy an external Blu-ray player, get that Leawo software, bada bing, bada boom, you are in business. There you go. Anyway, Dogs of War, definitely worth checking out if you haven't already. It is currently streaming on Amazon Prime. Go out, let slip the Dogs of War, and watch yourself a damn fine mercenary film. All right, that'll wrap that up. Let's move on to the next film in our conversation. That'll be 1988's The Beast of War, also referred to simply as The Beast, but I'm going to be calling it Beast of War because it's a cooler title. Anyway, let's listen to the trailer.
Konstantin Koverchenko is a Russian soldier. He's fighting a war he does not believe in.
Put him under the track.
Under a commander he cannot trust. In a machine his enemies call the Beast.
When the old man gets on your back, there's no way to shake him off.
He's torn between following orders.
Take him now, he's a traitor. No.
And following his conscience.
Shut up! This time your insubordination is going to get you a court-martial. So will killing your own men, sir! Hand that rock!
Columbia Pictures presents The Beast of War.
Okay, so 1988's The Beast of War, also just referred to as The Beast. It was directed by Kevin Reynolds, written by William Mastrosimone, I believe that's the proper way to pronounce the name, but I could be mistaken there, based off of his play, Nanawate, which was released earlier in the 1980s. And the film stars George Zunza, Jason Patrick, Stephen Bauer, Stephen Baldwin, Eric Avery, and Don Harvey. Okay, so the premise of Beast of War. It's set in 1981 in Afghanistan, where, of course, the Soviet Union is embroiled in a rather brutal war with the indigenous Afghanis, particularly the group of freedom fighters known as the Mujahideen. And it is, in some ways, a very unbalanced war. The Soviets are bringing the latest and greatest of military technology, as personified by their gigantic tank, which is referred to as the Beast by the Mujahideen. Whereas the Afghani freedom fighters are fighting with, borrowed rifles from the British. They have I think they're using a Lee Enfield, and basically any weapons that they can salvage, including some AK-47s as well as an RPG. Now, essentially, this story is a tale of two groups. You have a Soviet tank squad, all set around their tank, led by their commander, Tank Boy Daskal, played by George Zunza, as well as his other tankers, including Konstantin Kovarchenko, played by Jason Patrick, Anatoly Golikov, played by Stephen Baldwin, and Kaminsky, played by Donald Patrick Harvey. Now, they're not most of the tankers are not terribly happy with their assignment. They're far from their support lines. They're in the middle of the Afghanistan desert in a fucking tank. And the person that is most critical of what they're doing in Afghanistan, i.e. basically becoming, an invading force, kind of analogous to the Nazis at times, is Kovarchenko, played by Jason Patrick, which puts him very much at odds with the tank commander, Daskal, who is a he's a Soviet patriot. When he was a boy, he fought in Stalingrad. He comes from the tradition that you give everything you can to the Soviet cause, and when you have nothing left to give, you give your life for Mother Russia. And so there is a great deal of conflict between the two of them as this tank rumbles around. Now, opposing them are the forces of the Mujahideen, played by the recently promoted Khan Taj, played by Stephen Bauer. They are terribly overmatched by the weapons of the Soviets, and the Soviets have been absolutely massacring the Afghanistan people, both the villages, poisoning their water supply, brutally executing them, including in one notable account, running over them with a tank tread in a fucking harrowing scene. But they will continue fighting because this is their home, and they will do everything they can to expel these foreign invaders. Now, as the movie goes along, the conflict between Kovarchenko and Daskal reaches its peak, and Kovarchenko is actually cast out from the tank, left tied to a rock, and essentially left to die, his body booby-trapped in order to potentially take down some of the Mujahideen, which have chased this tank, which is leaking fuel, slowly breaking down, essentially into a pass where there is no escape. They're very outnumbered, but they're going to do everything they can to take out the Mujahideen, including sacrificing somebody who's critical of their entire military cause. This leads to Kovarchenko being found by the Afghanis, and due to a previous kind of schooling in Afghani traditions, particularly the notion of nanawate, which is essentially asking for sanctuary amongst one's enemies. He's able to ingratiate himself into the Mujahideen and actually join forces with them to battle the Beast, his former tank crew. And that is the basic premise of 1988's The Beast of War. Again, a film that was very highly recommended to me at great length from a listener by the name of Nick. He was very, very strong about his recommendation for Beast of War. And as I said before, Eventually, I thought the premise of it sounded interesting enough that I felt the movie was worth checking out, particularly as it exists within our current climate. Of course, I don't need to tell any of you about what America's history in Afghanistan has been. It's entirely possible that some of my listeners are actually even younger than the war in Afghanistan. And it seems cruelly appropriate that we're talking about this film right now, considering that we're, if everything has gone according to plan, I need to check the news, we've actually withdrawn from Afghanistan, that we finally pulled out of that country, bringing to an end of about 20 years, or just about 20 years of fighting. Yeah, it's been a long war. In some cases, it's been referred to as a forever war, a quagmire that we've never really had a way of getting out of. Say what you want. There's, of course, many different opinions about why we went there, what our purpose of continuing fighting there. It's a fucking mess, and I'm unqualified to actually speak to it with any great sort of authority. I just think it's relatively interesting that we're talking about a film set in Afghanistan in the 1980s, right at a point when we're preparing to leave Afghanistan, that we find ourselves in the same position that the Russians found themselves in for the longest time when they decided to invade Afghanistan. And those corollaries between the Russian experience and the American experience were even felt back in the 1980s before we had started invading that particular country, where the experiences of the Soviets within Afghanistan were in many ways likened to our experiences in Vietnam. A technologically superior force just basically brought to a standstill by a less sophisticated military force, but one that was very dedicated towards defending their homeland, driving back a foreign invader using whatever means were at their disposal. And in the 1980s, when this whole fight was going on, there was a lot of sort of these comparisons drawn between the Soviet experience in Afghanistan and our own experience in Vietnam. And simultaneously, there was a lot of sympathy played out towards the Mujahideen. After all, they were fighting our enemies at this time. They were freedom fighters defending their land against the Soviet menace. There was a lot of sympathy in various elements of pop culture towards the plight of the Mujahideen. And it was that inherent sympathy that essentially gave birth to the story of The Beast, that, as I mentioned, was based off of a play by William Mastrosimone that he wrote called Nanawate, that term referring towards sanctuary amongst one's enemies. It's a Pashto term utilized in Afghanistan. Now, the little bit of background of how this story came together, Mastrosimone, in an interview that was provided to me by Nick, the person who originally requested that I take a look at Beast of War, he talks about how in the early 1980s, coming across the story of the fighting in Afghanistan and being very moved by the image of a Mujahideen fighter and the dedication that this person had towards defending its homeland against this clearly superior force. And is so moved by this particular account that Mastrosimone actually traveled to Afghanistan to find out firsthand what was going on in this country. Who were these people that were fighting the Soviets? And feeling that he wasn't getting the full story from the news reporting at the time. Now, from everything that I was reading about his accounts in Afghanistan, they were simultaneously incredibly harrowing, particularly when he saw the full-on execution of a squad of Russian soldiers who he couldn't help but think looked just like Americans, and just the hardships of existing within this land. So he came back from Afghanistan very changed and used his experience to inform his play Nanawate. Now, it was that play that caught the attention of director Kevin Reynolds, who I believe at this point he had already helped write Red Dawn. Of course, it was released in 1984, directed by John Milius. John Milius also wrote the screenplay for that. And he had already directed the Steven Spielberg-produced film Fandango, which I have not seen. In fact, I'm not too terribly familiar with Fandango. But around this time, he'd come across a treatment for the beast and actually went out to see the play. And he was immediately struck with just how cinematic this whole thing was, and immediately approached William Mastrosimone with the idea of transferring the play into a film, with Mastrosimone coming on board to write the screenplay. And it was Kevin Reynolds' sort of influence that resulted in the film that we have now, as well as some of the artistic choices that have been somewhat a point of contention among some of the responses I've read concerning this film, but also were deliberate choices that were made in order to impart the inherent messaging behind this film, and by extension of that, Mastrosimoni's original play of Nanawate. Now again, the play was written with an idea of drawing a comparison between the events in Afghanistan between the Soviets and our experiences within Vietnam, whilst at the same time providing an equally sympathetic view towards the Soviet men on the ground fighting this war, as well as the Mujahideen. That's what's one thing that's very interesting about this film. It ends up being kind of split sympathies. While we do have a character that comes off as unambiguously bad, or overwhelmingly bad. There's elements of ambiguity in the form of the character of Tank Boy Daskal, played by George Zunza. And nevertheless, all of these characters do have layers to them. And at various points, the sympathy and the presentation of their particular point of view is given a platform in this film, and it becomes this rather nuanced view of these people at war. We don't get a whole lot of conversation about the greater socio-political motivations for the Soviets invading Afghanistan, but we do get the soldiers' side of these things. And even though we do have the kind of more villainous character of Daskal, and the terrible things that he does in the furtherance of this war, we do get an insight into his particular character, and indeed his overwhelming motivation driven by his patriotism for his country. As I said before, he is a dyed-in-the-wool Soviet, willing to give all for the furtherance of the Soviet ideal. And while you can see a little bit of the cracks forming at the edge of his ideology as the film goes along, nevertheless, it is his overarching dedication and patriotism that provides the motivation for his character. But the other more sympathetic characters that arose is, of course, Jason Patric's character of Konstantin Kovachenko and Stephen Bau's character of Khan Taj. And focusing on Kovachenko at this point, and particularly the casting of Jason Patric, that does feed into that aforementioned criticism of an artistic choice that was made in this film in the presentation of these characters. Because we have a Russian crew played by Americans. George Zunza, who some people might recognize for his role in Tobe Hooper's Salem's Lot, which was recently covered on Invasion of the Podcast. So if you're listening to that as well, go check out their particular coverage of it. It was a fun little conversation as part of their Pale Boy Summer. I will say Zunza is completely unrecognizable in this. He lobbied hard for this role and actually lost a shit ton of weight in order to play this tank commander. But you have George Zunza, who is very American. You have Jason Patric, very American. Stephen fucking Baldwin, very American. Donald Patrick Harvey, very American. And yet all of these guys are playing Russians, and none of them are even attempting an accent. Now, that might get some immediate eye rolls. The idea is like, oh, fuck, they cast Americans as foreign guys. They didn't even try to pull it off. But to hear Kevin Reynolds speak about that was a very deliberate choice. By having these characters speak with American accents to appear as, for all indications, Americans, it was to essentially heighten the comparison between their experiences in Afghanistan and our experiences in Vietnam, and also to kind of sand away the idea of them being foreign, the idea of them being the other, the idea of them being the enemy, to show a common humanity between these Soviets in Afghanistan and the Americans that were watching it. This was a very deliberate choice on behalf of Kevin Reynolds. And while this artistic choice has been called out by some critics of this film as, as a questionable one. Again, the idea of casting Americans with American accents, using American terminology as Russians, tank soldiers. To me, I can see what he was going for. He wanted them to feel just like us. The same experience, as I mentioned, that William Mastrosimone had when he went to Afghanistan and when he encountered these Russians that had been captured by the Mujahideen. He saw them as people just like him. And it was that element of common humanity that plays out throughout the play, and it's certainly at play within this film that, of course, Mastrosimone wrote. And it is the elements of the common humanity that arise in the various interactions between Kovalchenko and Stephen Bauer's character of the Khan Taj. Even though they have no common language, they still are able to find a sort of common humanity between the two of them, anchored as it is within the Pashto tradition of Nanawate, the asking of sanctuary from one's enemy. The casting of Stephen Bauer was an interesting choice as well, also considering that Stephen Bauer is a Cuban. You probably best know him as Manolo from Scarface. But still, he does a pretty goddamn good job in this role. Actually, there weren't any Afghanis actually cast in this role, or even Arabs cast in this role. The majority of them were, I think, Israeli, though Eric Avari is in this film, and he's Indian American. He shows up as an Afghani native who's working with the Russians, and even his motivations get some exploration, talking about why he's willing to betray his country. And his explanation is saying that, Afghanistan is a small country that needs to join the modern world. And we are a flea on the tail of a bear, I think is the way he describes it. And the only way he feels his country can survive is through cooperation with one of the great imperial powers, in this case, the Soviets. Now, for all of this interplay of interesting characterization that work within this film, this is also very much an action movie. And it's an action movie with some rather brutal stakes, because, as I say, the major conflict is a group of Russians in a single tank in the middle of nowhere, the tank slowly rattling apart around them, surrounded by enemies. Yes, they have a technological superiority because the tank is aptly called a beast. It is something that the Afghanis really don't have a counter to. But they are still dedicated. They are still greatly outnumber the Russian tankers in there. And they did manage to get a hold of an RPG, though they are having some trouble getting it to work. But every moment that the tank trundles along, it's slowly falling apart. It's slowly succumbing to the desert and succumbing to the fighting. And that just elevates the tension between these characters that are existing within this tank. And in many ways, you can actually view this as kind of an interesting precursor to another film that we discussed previously on the show, the film Fury, which, of course, dealing with an American tank crew. And a kind of the idea of this mobile home that you have, this engine of war that becomes the home base and the sanctuary, and in some cases, the death trap for the people that are stuck within. And some of the actual tank fighting between this one tank and the group of Mujahideen fighters, it's actually very, very thrillingly shot action sequences, a tribute to Kevin Reynolds' directing. Now, Kevin Reynolds, of course, as I said, he wrote Red Dawn along with John Milius. He wrote and directed Fandango, and then following The Beast, he would actually go on to direct Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Aha, I told you there would be another Robin Hood popping up. It was that film that would define a lot of his later work, particularly the fact that his collaboration with Kevin Costner on Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, would lead to him being brought back by Costner to direct Waterworld in 1995, as well as the 2012 miniseries with Kevin Costner and Bill Paxton, Hatfields and McCoys. So, we had a bit more directorial work for Kevin Reynolds off of that. However, it does feel like Waterworld did kind of trip up his career a little bit. It was considered something of a flop, and none of the other films that he directed after that quite reached the scale of what he was doing with stuff like, Waterworld or Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. So he did direct 187, which I do recall being a relatively interesting film, as well as the 2002 version of The Count of Monte Cristo, which I have not seen. Also, apparently did a biblical drama in 2016, Risen. Haven't seen that one either. Anyway, but it's interesting to look at a film like The Beast in context of that, because you can still see some comparable themes that he would explore, particularly in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. The idea of the two people from different cultures coming together against a singular enemy. Of course, it's played out in much more broader, pulpier terms, or at least more traditional action blockbustery terms, with the relationship between Kevin Costner and Morgan Freeman in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, in comparison to Jason Patric and Stephen Bauer in Beast of War. But still, there's certain kind of through lines that permeate throughout that. Now, Beast of War came out in 1988, which astute fans of action cinema, particularly action cinemas that are placed within the context of Afghanistan, will note was the same year of the release of Rambo 3, which, again, of course, was also set in Afghanistan. It was probably the first film that I ever remember seeing that presented a sympathetic view of the of Afghanis, a view that would become decidedly more controversial post-2001 when we decided to invade Afghanistan and were there for 20 years, and all of a sudden there was a dearth of positive portrayals of the Mujahideen within our arts and culture, for obvious reasons. Now, it was the same release of Stallone's Rambo 3, or at least the preparations for that actually would somewhat spell doom for Kevin Reynolds' film, The Beast of War. Now, when this film was originally put together, it was set to be distributed by Columbia Pictures. However, sometime between the production of the film, the greenlighting of Beast of War, and its eventual release in 1988, there was a leadership change in Columbia. And whenever something like that happens, wherever somebody new comes in to kind of take over operations, there is a tendency for films that were put into production under the old regime to kind of get buried. And unfortunately, that's what happened with The Beast of War. Add to it was Rambo 3, which was released by TriStar Pictures, which was a sister company to Columbia. Now, it was decided by the hierarchy at the time, from what I was reading, that Rambo 3 would be the commercially more viable way forward for Columbia compared to, this film Beast of War. Particularly since, one, it's the third film in a rather established blockbuster franchise with a huge lead in the form of Sylvester Stallone. Two, it is decidedly more in keeping with, shall we say, the slightly jingoistic mindset of the people of America in the 1980s, where, fuck the Soviets. They are the unambiguous bad guys. We don't need positive portrayals of Russians, thank you very much, in our Reagan's America. And so it was decided that essentially the Beast would be buried. That Columbia would put out Rambo 3, put all of its efforts behind that through TriStar, that putting out two Afghanistan films at the same time, they would seem to be kind of in competition with each other, so they would just simply bury the Beast and move forward with Rambo 3 instead. However, they still were contractually obligated to release The Beast of War into some theaters. However, it received a rather anemic release. I think it only hit just a handful of screens, and as such, ended up being a tremendous flop. I mean, it was made on a modest budget of around $8 million, but it only ended up turning in a box office of about $161,000, because, again, Columbia decided to fucking bury it. And buried it stayed for the longest time, though through various screenings on television, it did acquire something of a cult following that exists to this day, but still exists as a somewhat more obscure film. Indeed, when I announced that I was covering this film, there were some people that were like, man, I never even heard of this. And then other people, it's like, oh yeah, I think I remember seeing this on TV, and I remember it being good. So it's one of those things where those that have seen The Beast, or The Beast of War, to utilize its better title, in my opinion, do really enjoy it. And one can't help but wonder if Rambo 3 wasn't a thing, and if the management of Columbia had stayed together, what kind of response that this would have had. Perhaps it would have been regarded as, an upper echelon war film. Because certainly the quality is there. There's some tremendously strong performances throughout this entire movie, and when the action hits, it hits really, really hard, grounded in this sort of gritty realism that is very much an artistic and thematic counterpoint to the over-the-top bombast that was at play within Rambo 3. And also was very much the style of action movies that were made in the 1980s, This is not a film that you could... curiously enough, it's a film that feels much closer in tone to something like the first Rambo film, First Blood, than what Stallone was doing by the time Rambo 3 rolled around. It's interesting to think, in an alternative world, what the reputation of The Beast would be if it had actually gotten the release it deserved. As it stands, it's a cult film, but one that is woefully underseen. As I said before, I'd never even heard of this film before I started receiving emails about it from listener Nick, and at this point I want to definitely thank him for his perseverance in trying to get me to watch this film, because I enjoyed the shit out of it. And I don't know if it's a film I actively would have sought out unless it had gotten that kind of persistent word of mouth around it. And I'm glad I've had the opportunity to see it and impart it onto other people, to get people to go out and watch this film, because I do believe this is a worthy movie for consideration and a worthy movie to check out. Now, thankfully, it is readily available if you do want to seek it out, and I highly encourage you to do so, because it is currently streaming on Amazon Prime again. So if you are in America and you have access to Amazon Prime and subscribe to that service, it is currently available streaming on there. That's how I watched it. As far as I can tell, there has not been a Blu-ray release of this film. There is a DVD that appears to be very, very cheap right now. I think you pick it up for like $8 or so. But if you do want to watch it, it is available just to watch on Amazon Prime. But also be forewarned. Much like Dogs of War, there is a little bit of fuckery going on with how you can access it. That if you look it up under one title of just The Beast, it will show up as a rental. But it is available under the title Beast of War as a stream, so it's really weird. Actually, no, it's no. Even the streaming one is available as just a as just under the title The Beast. So I don't know what the fuck is going on anymore. Everything's confusing. Everything is confusing. I don't know why there's two entries for it. Regardless, if you do a little bit of digging, you will find it. It is available to stream. Head over to Just Watch is the easier way to get a hold of it. Again, Just Watch is the best website for figuring out where things are streaming. Type in Beast of War, click through to it, to Amazon Prime, bada boom, you'll be set, and you'll have a damn fine movie to watch. This is a film that I hope that more people will seek out, because it is a worthy film in sort of the broader action pantheon, particularly as it exists in reference to today. Is kind of an interesting little capper to our 20-year experience within Afghanistan. And it's an experience that will continue in one way or another, because I just received news today that apparently China is looking to develop its interest within Afghanistan. So yeah, Soviets tried it, the Americans tried it, now China's gonna try it. Let's see how well that works out for them. I'm sure we'll get plenty of their own films talking about their experiences within Afghanistan. And hey, and as a connection into Dogs of War, they're also doing economic inroads into Africa. Let's see how that works out for them. Fucking hell, man. History. Doomed to repeat it. Doomed to repeat it. But, again, I can't speak to authority of that. I'm just a guy who watches the movies and makes recommendations, and I recommend you should check out The Beast of War. It's currently streaming on Amazon Prime. Alright, that'll do us. Let's transition and get into a little bit of feedback.
feedback.
Alright, so we have some feedback for this episode, and it comes courtesy of a longtime listener and also supporter of the show, Trevor. And he says, "Greetings, El Goro. Hope you had a great 4th of July weekend and are recovering from your celebration." I'm recovering. That's definitely a thing. Just wanted to shoot you a little feedback. I got a chance to watch The Beast this morning for the first time, and I gotta say, I really enjoyed it. Awesome. People are checking out this movie. The Soviet-Afghan War isn't something that gets a lot of attention in cinema, and it's a bit of a shame. While the technologically inferior Afghans using guerrilla tactics to great effects against the Soviet juggernaut, this was a bad war, similar in the vein of the Vietnam War, with an estimated 2 million Afghans killed, not to mention the multiple mass killings of civilians by the Soviets, most notably the Logman massacre, where 500 civilians were rounded up and executed. Draws some similarities to what happened at the My Lai massacre, doesn't it? Oh, yes it does. I'm sure we could spend hours talking about this one conflict and the long-term ramifications because of it. But I do want to talk a little bit about the movie. I had never heard of this one before, and seeing it was on Prime, I knew I had to check it out. I really enjoyed Jason Patric's performance as Kovachenko. I think he did a good job playing a soldier who is willing to do his duty up until he's forced to be no longer a soldier, but a murderer. I also really appreciated the scene when Samad and him are discussing Pashtunwali. That's the kind of the honor code amongst the Afghanis. I remember being taught this during our language and culture course during our pre-deployment. I think it's important for people to understand this code of honor that the Afghans live by. Also, I did like George Zunza's performance as the tank commander. I definitely got some Quint/Sergeant Barnes from Platoon kind of vibes, and I can definitely appreciate that. As for Stephen Baldwin, it's always nice when he's not acting like a complete goofball and instead plays this sort of naive idiot. Readily agree on that. Stephen Baldwin's actually very sympathetic in this movie. Bit of a goofball, but not nearly as bad as some of his other movies. So I just want to say thank you for another incredible show. Maybe one day I'll get off my damned ass and finally do my own. By the way, if you ever want to try to figure out the shit show that is Afghanistan, read Descent into Chaos by Ahmed Rashid. Take care, bro. Trevor. Well, thank you very much for that, sir. I'm glad that you had the opportunity to watch the movie and that you enjoyed it as well. Certainly your experiences in your military career would bring a very interesting insight to this, and I'm glad that it was able to resonate with you as it did with me. And hopefully more people will take the opportunity to check this film out now that it's been kind of getting out there. It's available, as I said, to watch on Prime. I don't have the biggest audience in the world, but, you know, I have some dedicated movie fans in here, and I think there's some enjoyment to be found in The Beast of War, or just The Beast, as I think it's listed under Prime. So thank you very much for that, sir. If you want to be awesome like Trevor, you can send me an email, talkwithoutrhythm@gmail.com. You can also leave me a comment on the website, TWORpodcast.blogspot.com. I'm at Facebook at facebook.com/talkwithoutrhythm. Also on the Talk Without Rhythm Facebook group, just do a search for Talk Without Rhythm, ask to join, I will let you in. I'm on Twitter at TWORpodcast, Tumblr at tworp.tumblr.com, Instagram at L_Goro. If you'd rather stream these episodes, we're available on Stitcher. And if you're looking for ways to support the show, check out the Patreon at patreon.com/tworp. You can sign up for as low as $1 a month, get access to the first 6 years of Talk Without Rhythm content, as well as exclusive stuff that I record just for the Patreon supporters. And of course, if you subscribe at higher tiers of patronage, you will have the opportunity to book new episodes of the show as part of the Patreon Picks program. All the details can be found at patreon.com/tworp. And as I said, it's back to the Patreon Picks that we were going, because in between the last episode and this episode, we picked up a new Tworp Elite patron, best known as under the handle Kihar, or Dissecting Worlds over on Twitter. Long-time correspondent over on the Twitter, so it's great to see Kihar join the ranks of the Tworp Elite. And Kihar has selected 2 films for the next episode. We're going to go ahead and do his pick right away. because he's the only one that's pending right now, and has picked 2 British nautical films. So we get to 2 British war films from the 1950s, films that I'd never even heard of, so this is going to be brand new territory for me. But the films that Kihar selected for me to discuss on the next episode is the 1953 film, The Cruel Sea, as well as the 1955 film The Ship That Died of Shame, which was apparently released in the United States under the title P.T. Raiders. So I've not seen either of these films, but they appear to be both based off of the writings of Nicholas Montserrat. Again, somebody I'm not terribly familiar with. I'm going to have to reach out to my buddy Harper to see if he's familiar with them, just kind of get a sense of these things, as well as perhaps Key Harp will send in some additional feedback to kind of give us grounding in these films. But regardless, that's going to be the next episode, folks. 1953's The Cruel Sea, and 1955's The Ship That Died of Shame, both of which were selected by Twerp Elite patron Kihar. So I'm certainly looking forward to that, and hopefully you are as well. So yeah, that'll do us for this episode. For those of us that are in America, hopefully you enjoyed your 4th of July weekend. Hopefully you have less of a hangover than I do. And yeah, even if you're not, hopefully you had a good time. And yeah, we're done. So from the house on the edge of the park, this is El Goro, and you have been listening to Talk Without Rhythm, the only podcast that will not attract the world. Adios.
Push the button, Max.